We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. My name is Ken McKenzie. I'm the Research Director at the School of Public Policy. Along with Robert Mansell, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with, I'm managing the Alberta Futures Project. So welcome to our first Alberta Futures webinar. I'll be brief, as I'm sure you all want to get your teeth into this as much as I do. I don't need to tell anyone here that Alberta finds itself in new territory at this juncture, as we hopefully emerge soon from the COVID pandemic. I think we've all been through booms and busts before, but I think this time really is different. Even prior to the pandemic, we saw rising debt levels, falling natural resource revenues, and there will no doubt be structural changes to the economy, both due to the pandemic and as environmental policies are imposed both domestically and worldwide. Really, again, I think this means that we have some challenges going forward and that this time is different. So we think a long-term perspective is required, and that's why we call this the Alberta Futures Project. We need to think about the economy going forward and the sustainability of the finances. And so that's really the genesis of this Alberta Futures Project. Now, over the next few weeks, we're going to be releasing a series of reports in three broad areas: Alberta's economic future, Alberta's fiscal future, and Alberta's healthcare future. And these reports are pre-publications of chapters in three forthcoming ebooks on those same themes. So we solicited a wide range of individuals and experts who were asked to provide their own perspectives on the challenges facing the province going forward. And as a part of that, we're hosting some webinars on selected papers. And of course, that's why we're here today. We're very fortunate to have Danielle Smith with us here today to moderate the discussion. Danielle really needs no introduction, so I won't, but I will say that you're well familiar with her very impressive resume. And I must say that, and I'm sure you'll agree, that she brings a really unique combination of policy smarts and media and political savvy to the table. And we're very fortunate to have Danielle with us here today to moderate the discussion. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Danielle to introduce you to our presenters and get the ball rolling.
Thank you so much, Professor McKenzie. I go back to my economics degree that I took at the University of Calgary, and of course, Ken McKenzie and Robert Mansell were very key in shaping my thinking about the world we live in and some of the fiscal challenges we've had. We've had them periodically over the years, as you know, but perhaps no more serious than what we're dealing with right now. We don't want to be gloomy here. There are solutions. And the question will be, will our politicians be persuaded by some of the solutions being put on the table? We are going to go through today, and two of the papers, I think Professor McKenzie said that there's a 20 that are coming. So these are the first two. And let me tell you how you can help me out. Number one is you'll see at the bottom of your screen that there is a question box. So if you have a question to ask as we're going along, feel free to do that, because sometimes that's what happens is we're going to start with some presentations and something will trigger a question for you. So put it in the box. And you can also see if you have a little thumbs up on the side there, you can thumbs up and approve and upvote the question. That'll make it easier for me to identify the ones that you are the most interested in having our speakers address. In addition, if you have to leave early, don't worry, you're not going to miss anything, because the recordings of these webinars will be posted later on the School of Public Policy website, and you will receive a follow-up link in your email from where you registered. So without further ado, let's get to the presentation. We will hear our speakers speak for about 10 minutes each, and then we will get into a bit of a panel dialogue, and we will get right to your questions, and we'll finish up on time to be respectful of everybody's time. So first of all, today's presentation is on Alberta Futures, New Fiscal Territory, Anchors, and Addressing the Debt. And we've got two presenters, Dr. Trevor Toome, he's Research Fellow with the School of Public Policy, and his presentation is on fiscal planning and sustainability in Alberta, followed by Dr. Bev Dalby, who's a Research Fellow with the School of Public Policy as well, presenting his paper, Fiscal Anchor for Alberta. So let's begin. I'll now introduce to you Dr. Trevor Toome. Dr. Toome, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. And thank you to everyone for taking some time today to be with us to start the conversation around Alberta's fiscal future today and our future in many other dimensions, as Professor Mackenzie noted. So I'll go ahead first and share my screen. I have a couple slides that I want to go through with you, really summarizing just the high level results of the paper that's available at policyschool.ca. And I focus on really the longer term fiscal challenges that we face. Now, of course, everything that I will be talking about today is in the context of some really significant short-term fiscal challenges that we face in Alberta, that other provinces face, that the federal government faces, as we're looking at here with historic levels of borrowing through the pandemic, and indeed countries around the world are facing. So there are a lot of important questions to be asked around these broader fiscal challenges that the pandemic creates, but I do want to focus just on Alberta and some of the unique challenges that we need to confront here. So first, of course, the pandemic has led to about a $20 billion deficit for the fiscal year that just ended in March, and we're looking at a similarly sized level of borrowing for the upcoming fiscal year, which gradually declines, although even by 2023-24, as we see here, we're looking at a deficit in the order of about $7 to $8 billion. Now, of course, depending on developments between now and then, that number will change. But regardless of what the specific magnitude is over the next few years, I want to ask, where do we go from here? What are the longer term challenges that we face? And I think important to that conversation is to recognize that Alberta really has entered new fiscal territory that has not been seen during the lifetimes of most Albertans. And a longer term perspective is required to not just overcome these challenges, but to ensure our finances remain sustainable well into the future. And so in my chapter, I present some new estimates on those long-term challenges, which I'll highlight for you in a minute. And in addition, I illustrate that financial volatility is a substantial and distinct challenge for the province, such that even if all of program expenditures in the province were funded through revenues rather than borrowing, there would still remain an important fiscal risk facing Alberta that vastly exceeds what we see facing other provinces. So just to start things off, new fiscal territory, well, there's two aspects of that I think are particularly important for us to appreciate. First, rising debt levels has been something that Alberta governments have been dealing with now since the financial crisis. And because of the pandemic and low oil prices in recent years, we are looking at debt levels that are going to be approaching 25% of Alberta's economy fairly soon. And this is new territory because we have not seen debt levels of that magnitude since the 1930s. And so this is a change in our fiscal situation that is very important for us to fully appreciate, not just because rising debt levels leads to rising interest rates, which is true everywhere, but it's a particular concern in Alberta because, as I'll illustrate, rising debt levels exposes the province to a degree of fiscal risk that exceeds what we see elsewhere. So effectively, one important takeaway message from me today is that this 25% debt to GDP ratio is exposing Alberta to a level of fiscal risk that is much larger than provinces with even higher debt levels than this face. So I'll circle back to that point. The second important dimension in which we are entering new fiscal territory involves natural resource revenues. And so here we're looking at the share of natural resource revenues out of total government revenues in Alberta. Historically, it fluctuates, of course, and in recent years prior to the financial crisis, accounting for between 1/4 to 1/3 of the provincial budget. But since 2014, they have accounted for less than 10% of revenues. And that means that for many years now, and for potentially more years to come, Alberta has not experienced this kind of structurally low natural resource revenues since the Leduc #1 discovery in the late 1940s. And roughly speaking, we need about 1/4 of our revenues to come from natural resources in order to balance. And so what we're seeing in 2020 is that the gap between what we're actually raising from natural resource revenues and what we need to balance, that gap is larger than at any point in Alberta history. Going forward, that creates a particularly important challenge for the province. Now, to get a handle intuitively on the scale of the long-term challenge that we face as a province, one way to do that is to construct longer-term projections for expenditures and revenues for different components of the budget and illustrate those in different ways. In the chapter, I showcase one way of representing these longer-term challenges with what I call a multi-year budget, if you will. So imagine instead of a 1-year document, we were presented with a 10-year document or a 25-year document or a 50-year document. And then we were to summarize revenues and expenditures by category in that way. I'll illustrate that here in this table. And so think about this as highlighting for us the magnitude of the longer-term challenge that we face. So I'll start with revenues. These numbers are revenues by source as a share of Alberta's economy, averaging across however many years you want to have in mind. So a 10-year time horizon is the first column, 25 is the second, and so on. So overall, revenues from all sources, taxes, natural resources, other own source revenues, fees and fines and things like that, add up to about 14% of GDP on average over the next 10 years. That declines, though, to less than 13.5%, and then declines further still to about 12.5% of GDP when you average over the next half century. So revenue growth in Alberta is not projected to keep pace with overall economic growth. They will grow slower than the economy for a variety of reasons that I unpack in the paper, and I'll just kind of gloss over the details here. That's a big challenge, especially when combined to expenditures that increase as a share of overall economic activity. And those increases are importantly due to primarily healthcare spending growth, about 6% of GDP on average over the next 10 years, but over a half century time horizon represent about 6.5% of GDP. So rising health spending from an aging population is a challenge, and combined with decreasing revenue growth, not just from natural resources, but from a variety of other components, that leads to a structural gap in the province's finances that will persist for many years. And it's roughly speaking about 4% of GDP. And so that is a large challenge for the province. I guess in today's terms, you can think of that as a structural gap equivalent to about $12 billion or so this year. And thinking about how to close that gap is an important challenge. You could look at the spending side or the revenue side. I'll just briefly kind of highlight some of the numbers there. On the spending side, this is certainly something that the current government has prioritized, and indeed even the former government had recognized is an issue where because of large revenues from natural resources, spending levels in Alberta do tend to exceed what we see in other provinces. That is, in the current government's fiscal plan, something that will be closed, or that spending differential will be closed by about 2022, 2023. And so in a sense, the spending problem side, that is often the label given to that side of the budget by some, will be addressed in the next couple of years. But even after that, a challenge will remain in terms of the difference between revenue and spending. And so thinking about changes on the other side of the budget will be important to come. It's especially important because not just revenues declining in Alberta in recent years, revenues are quite volatile here. And that volatility is a unique challenge that we do need to confront. So regardless of what you think of as the optimal level of government revenues, the ups and downs, the swings that we need to deal with in Alberta, that is a revenue problem to address. Now, it's fairly intuitive where that revenue volatility comes from, and that is, of course, natural resource revenues. And so I like this way to visualize it here, where in red, we see the natural resource revenues that we need to balance the budget, and that rises and falls depending on revenues from other sources or spending decisions that governments make. But in blue, that's the actual resource revenues that we take in. They're, of course, volatile from changes in oil prices primarily, but the difference between the two is not just volatile, but also now growing quite large. Now, given I've already spoken for 10 minutes, I just want to end on my one important takeaway point, and that is, who cares about volatility? What does that tell us about how we should balance for the longer term? Well, the government laid out 3 fiscal anchors, and my colleague, Professor Dalby, will speak more about fiscal anchors, but they highlighted 3: bring spending in line to what we see elsewhere. Second, ensure that debt does not grow beyond 30% of GDP. And then third, which maybe not, the third one is not really a fiscal anchor, but they laid out a clear goal of, after the pandemic, addressing the budget challenges in the province and bringing debt levels down. And so this volatility that Alberta sees can help us understand what maybe an, I don't want to say appropriate, but what level of debt should Alberta consider as a potential target, if you will. Well, the volatility here that we see in Alberta's economy, in the budget situation, the larger our debt levels are, the more exposed to that risk we are. And I won't go through the calculations here, but what we're looking at here is the risk that we face reflected in terms of the variance in future debt levels that we are facing, even if we fully balance the structural budget itself. The fiscal risk that we see here in Alberta with a 10% debt to GDP ratio is equivalent to what Ontario, BC, and Quebec would face with a 40% debt to GDP ratio. So given the volatility here, we ought to be, I think, in a sense, aiming at that smaller debt level. So I will end it there. And thank you, Danielle, for letting me steal 2 minutes of everyone's time.
That's perfect. I just have a couple of questions that I want to ask you so that we don't get too far away from your presentation before you have a chance to answer them. One of the things that you meant, it looks like our gap, that shortfall we have, 4% of GDP, stays fairly consistent over your long-term time horizon. And I'm just wondering what you're expecting to happen to GDP growth. I think we've gotten accustomed to just allowing growth to solve this problem for us. And so there's sort of a related question to that, but are we likely to see a doubling of our GDP over that time horizon? So rather than have a $12 billion shortfall, we're going to go to a $24 billion shortfall. Are you able to put some of that into context for us about what you see on growth?
Sure. So my baseline projection here of that gap hovering around 4% of GDP it is indeed fairly stable across these different time horizons, but that's not to say that there isn't uncertainty around those numbers. What happens to oil prices affects revenue directly through royalties. It also affects GDP growth and therefore revenues and other sources. So there is a lot of uncertainty around those numbers. economic growth, what I'm assuming here is a set of fairly standard assumptions. So economic growth in Alberta and elsewhere comes from, well, population growth, and Alberta is lucky to have a young population overall. So the level of aging here is less than some other provinces. We still anticipate inflows of workers from abroad through immigration and also interprovincial migration. So building on that, in addition, there are productivity gains over time, where how much each worker produces in real economic activity increases over time. And I'm presuming that's about a 1% per year per worker growth in real productivity. And it's hard to really get too much higher than that or lower than that. So one could think about a range between 0.5% or 1.5%, but this 1% projection is fairly common. It's also what we use to project out the Canada Pension Plan sustainability, for example. So I'd say it's a fairly conservative set of assumptions.
Okay, one other question, and I know that you didn't want to get too into the weeds on it, but I think it's pretty easy for us to understand why expenditures are going to grow with an aging population in healthcare. One of the things that you really point out is your expectation that we're going to see a decline in the percentage of the working population. And just when we're talking about population growth, we're talking about the ability to attract workers, we're talking about increase in immigration. Why do you see that that's not going to keep up and we're going to actually see a decline in that percentage?
Well, as populations age, you'll have fewer people in the labor force as they transition to retirement. And certainly some provinces like Newfoundland, where they have an outflow of young workers, that pace of aging is significantly larger than in Alberta. It may very well be, it could potentially be that migration flows of young people compensate for aging, but that's not what the normal baseline projections are from even the government of Alberta or Statistics Canada in their demographic projections, that aging kind of dominates. And for some perspective here, that aging in terms of its effect on labor force participation, that represents about a 0.3% per year drag on economic growth. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but sustained over many years, that means by about 2050, the economy would be about 7% smaller than it otherwise would be. And that's about, just for perspective, 25 billion per year in foregone economic activity in today's terms. So if there are policies that governments can pursue to encourage and facilitate the inflow of younger workers, then that can certainly help.
Okay, thank you so much for that. That was Dr. Trevor Toome. We're going to now go on to Dr. Bev Dalby. And I had a degree of anxiety after reading both these papers. Now you can see why, is because there are some pretty significant challenges that we have to deal with. But Dr. Dalby has been involved on the 2019 Blue Ribbon Panel on Government Finances. So he's had a close look at it in giving some recommendations to government. He joins us now to present his paper, A Fiscal Anchor for Alberta. Dr. Dalby, take it away.
Good afternoon. So today I'm going to touch on the highlights of the paper that has just been released today, entitled A Fiscal Anchor for Alberta. Next slide, please. Yeah, so Trevor mentioned it, but in case people were unaware of it, actually in the recent Alberta budget, the government announced these fiscal anchors. That is, it is to bring spending in line with that of other provinces, keeping Alberta's net debt to GDP ratio below 30%, and adopting post-pandemic a clear path and timeline for balancing the budget. So I want to evaluate these anchors and what perhaps we could think of as more appropriate fiscal anchors for Alberta, with more of a short, medium-term perspective than I think the longer-term perspective that Trevor has been talking about. And in my view, these are complementary ways of approaching this problem. Next slide, please. So, in general, what are fiscal anchors? So, a fiscal anchor is really a policy that constrains a government's choices regarding its debt, deficits, expenditures, or interest payments. It's something that a government imposes on itself, if you will, in order to provide fiscal policies that are maybe predictable and perhaps more appropriate. I will tend to use the term fiscal anchor and fiscal rules interchangeably. Some people might see some slight differences among these, but so I'll use those two terms more or less the same. The question is, why adopt a fiscal anchor? Why would a government impose constraints on itself? Well, generally, it's important, I think, for the private sector, for individuals and businesses to have some idea of what direction the government's fiscal policy will take in the future. This helps with their investment decisions, savings decisions, work decisions. And so providing this fiscal anchor, fiscal rule helps the private sector make plans. It tends to reduce then the uncertainty about the direction of fiscal policy, and uncertainty we know is bad for investment decisions. Now that's fine, but then the question is, well, do fiscal anchors really work? And here I think that we, especially in Alberta, we might have some room for being skeptical. Since 1992, the government of Alberta has adopted 7 different fiscal rules. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I think it's up to you to decide on this, but these fiscal rules were abandoned. Generally, they were abandoned when they became binding or it was forced difficult decisions on the government. But governments around the world, I think over 90, according to the IMF, governments around the world have adopted some form of a fiscal anchor or fiscal rule. The IMF has done a considerable amount of study of the effects of fiscal rules on the performance of government's fiscal policies. And generally, they find that, as these quotes at the bottom of the page indicate, that fiscal rules do tend to be correlated with better fiscal policies, more stable fiscal policies. And they point out that while they're not a panacea, they do tend to reduce the bias towards government deficits, depending on the circumstances and the design features. So obviously, badly designed fiscal anchors are not going to help, but maybe better designed or well-designed anchors can help. Next slide, please. So what might be some of these characteristics of good fiscal rules? Well, first and foremost, promoting long-term fiscal sustainability. And this is where, fiscal rules, my discussion fits very well with Trevor's, because his has indicated the degree to which our current fiscal situation is not sustainable. And so the fiscal rules should be placed within the context of trying to achieve long-term fiscal sustainability. In the shorter term, fiscal rules should try to help stabilize the economy, to avoid the kind of pro-cyclical fiscal policies that can arise maybe in the absence of these rules, so that when the economy is booming and revenues are flowing in, the government's increased spending, which actually puts even more pressure on the economy, or conversely, by cutting spending, raising taxes when the economy slows down or is in a slump, which exacerbates the depth of the slump. So providing stability to economic activity through a more stable fiscal regime is very important. Another characteristic that I think is very important is that the fiscal rules should apply to some fiscal variables that the government can actually control or has some ability to modify. So for example, in the short to medium term, it's very hard for governments to do anything about interest payments. These are fixed payments. So any rules that have centered around interest payments are very difficult for a government to control or react to if the rule is based on that. And I also think it's important that the government should have some reasonable options for addressing a fiscal situation if the rule is binding. So they shouldn't have to, if the fiscal rule would imply some very harsh and measures, probably the rule will be abandoned and it would actually apply. So we need to think about rules that are feasible within the context that the government might find itself in. There are just some general characteristics of good rules. That is, they should be transparent. They should not be subject to manipulation or creative accounting. they should be coherent, and they should apply to broad components of the budget. So they shouldn't just focus on some narrow components, say, for example, highway spending or something like this. They should be broad measures that the government can control. And above all, the IMF stresses that they should be simple, flexible, and enforceable. Unfortunately, there may be trade-offs among these characteristics. So a rule that is simple may be inflexible, that it might force you to do things, the government to do things that are not appropriate in some circumstances, like, for example, a downturn. Again, flexible rules may not be simple. They may have to be quite context specific, and therefore maybe require some judgment in application. And rules that are enforceable, the more enforceable they are, the more they bind the government, again, the less flexible they might be. So we also have to think about how to package the rules so that they can more or less satisfy all of these characteristics. Next slide, please. So if within that context, let's just give you some of my thoughts on the three components of the fiscal anchors that the provincial government announced in the recent budget. Bringing spending in line with other provinces. As Daniel Smith mentioned, I was on the Blue Ribbon panel. Our mandate was to look at the expenditure side of the budget and to come up with appropriate policies, and that was also our feeling that should be a short to medium term goal of bringing Alberta's per capita spending in line with comparative provinces, and because we're spending more and broadly speaking not getting better results, so we should do it. And I think this is an appropriate goal because Albertans have been used to paying less in taxes than they're getting in services. I think they'll want to see that the spending is at an appropriate level before we think of other means of bringing our deficit the deficit down through revenue measures like a tax increase. However, bringing our spending into line with other provinces, I think, is a short to medium term goal, which Trevor's analysis suggests we might well be achieved in the next few years. In that case, I think we need to replace that rule with something that is, I think, more appropriate and actually one that is sort of favored by the IMF in their guide to good fiscal rules, and that is some rule around the growth rate of program spending. The second rule, the second aspect of the anchor that was announced is keeping the net debt to GDP ratio below 30%. So again, is it feasible? Well, I think if the government carries through with its planned fiscal plan that's announced in the budget, and if nominal, the rate of growth of nominal GDP is in the 5% range, which is what, again, they've been projecting, I think it would be feasible to maintain the net debt to GDP ratio below 30%, in particular around 25%. However, we know that, as again, Trevor's paper aptly indicates, Alberta's economy is more subject to volatility and therefore fiscal shocks that could easily, negative ones, send the debt to GDP ratio above 30%. Unfortunately, economic theory and economic models, at least for application, provide very little guidance as to what the optimal debt ceiling should be. If, for example, we had a negative shock that sent the debt to GDP ratio above 30%, would it make sense to bring it back down to 30%? This is a very difficult question and be very difficult to answer definitively. So I tend to place less emphasis on net debt to GDP ratios as a solid, or a guide, but not as a solid anchor. And the third component, adopting a clear path to balancing the budget. Again, I think it was appropriate to delay announcing very clearly a path because we're in the midst of this third wave of the pandemic, and there's a lot of uncertainty about the future and economic growth. So However, when we do have a clear path to balance, I think we need to explain it in terms of overall fiscal balance and not just the budget balance, which excludes capital spending, because capital spending is an important component of total spending and by implication often debt. Next slide, please. So my recommendations really are to supplement the debt ratio anchor with an operational fiscal rule around total spending. And I would tend to favor, as we suggested in the Blue Ribbon panel, of a moving average of the increase in household primary income as the expenditure rate anchor. I think the other things that are important as well are that the government of Alberta should be reporting its primary balance and fiscal balance along with its budget balance in the quarterly updates and annual budgets. Trevor's analysis again shows how important primary balance is for the debt sustainability. So we need to report those and think about those regularly. Finally, I think we need to conduct these kinds of long-term fiscal sustainability reviews every 4 years, and on the basis of those reviews, reevaluate and recalibrate our fiscal anchors. So with that, thank you, and I look forward to the questions.
All right, thanks so much for that, Bev. I just have a couple of questions I want to pose to you before we get to the questions that are being put forward by our audience members. And you guys are doing a great job upvoting the questions that you like, adding new ones. Feel free to continue doing that. Just click on the Q&A box. You can see what's already there. If you have a particular question you like that you want me to pose to either of our guests, let me know. But let me just try to get some clarification on a couple of things. Because one of the things that I would note, and I totally agree with you, that using a fiscal anchor as a share of revenues doesn't work because our revenues are so volatile. But why not consider having an anchor relative to expenditures? And I look at the municipal level of government, if memory serves me correctly, they aren't allowed to have their interest and principal payments exceed 10% of their expenditures. They're also required to balance their budget over a 3-year period, which both seem to be working at the municipal level. And I'm just wondering if you considered either of those as potential fiscal anchors.
Well, again, I tend to favor things that governments can control. If governments can't control their program spending, we're in trouble with any fiscal anchor. And so what they can control are operating spending and capital spending. So having a fiscal anchor that imposes discipline on that measure, I think is the primary road to fiscal sustainability. The other thing, I think what you were also including, though, something that included interest payments. And again, that's not a component you can control easily. So I guess my general view is a broad expenditure rule around growth, and I tend to favor one based on household income, because it's more related to what our population can generally afford to pay in taxes to support that spending.
Okay, let me ask you another question about this 4-year review, because there's a few questions along these lines about how do you hold the politicians to it? How do you make sure that they don't keep changing their mind? I mean, you pointed out they had 7 fiscal rules, and when it became inconvenient for them to abide by them, they got rid of them. So I'm wondering about your 4-year review. Is that sort of building in a public expectation that things might change every 4 years? Or does it create that same kind of instability of politicians knowing that they always have a way out? Why did you propose that?
I think it's obviously Trevor has done an analysis today. We can't count on Trevor doing this every year or every 4 years. And so I think of it as partly as a constant reminder to the public that we have these issues in front of it, and that the government would have to table this and address it. So I think that's my primary reason for putting it in there. It is, we're always being driven by short to medium term issues. We need to keep that longer term issue constantly in mind, and having a rule that would force the government to table a report like this every 4 years, especially at the start of a new mandate, would be, I think, useful.
Okay, you may have already answered the question that our listeners want to pose to Trevor. So let me get Trevor in to give a stab at it. Trevor, how do you encourage politicians to do this kind of long-term financial planning when their careers depend on the 4-year election cycle? I mean, has Bev proposed the right solution? You build it into the model that every 4 years you've got to redo this assessment, or do you have any other suggestions on that?
So I do completely agree with Bev that incorporating into Alberta's system of fiscal reporting, that we can add to that something that takes a broader panoramic view, if you will, of the province's finances and where it's going. And many other jurisdictions do this. Federally, we have a lot of great work done through the Parliamentary Budget Office, for example, but Ontario as well has long-term reporting on their fiscal situation. We could add that to just the regular part of budget reporting in Alberta. So not something that would require the government take specific action, but just ensures that good information and projections are out there. Jim Prentice's 2015 budget, for example, had a 10-year window being reported there. So that's good. And we could do that, and we could do more. And I am hopeful, though. I mean, there are great examples of governments of different parties working together, even across Canada. I think about the Canada Pension Plan reforms in the 1990s. This was a very big reform, very difficult reform, one that was about long-term sustainability of our public pension system. And that's really a great success story that we can look to at a time where, regardless of party or order of government, there was some really productive long-term decisions that were made.
Okay, there's a couple of questions around how we look at the revenue generation side of things. So I'll pose it in this perspective, in this context, because I know, Trevor, that you talked about the potential for a sales tax or a gas tax, and both of you mentioned if we had the tax structure of, say, Ontario, it would generate, I think, if my memory serves, something like $13 billion more in revenue for us. I think if we had the same tax structure as Quebec, it's a little bit higher than that. And so let me just put that to Bev. Is that the solution? Is just looking at what's working to generate more revenues in other provinces and matching that? And if that is the case, what are the things that we may have to consider? Should we be looking at a sales tax?
Well, I've been a long-term advocate of having a sales tax in Alberta. Again, I generally feel that it has been the appropriate policy in this phase of the fiscal adjustment to look at our spending relative to other comparative provinces and to try to get that into line. But I mean, Albertans, as a result of the constraint on spending, Albertans may start to feel, no, we would like to have more services. These services are providing benefits to us, improving the quality of life. In which case, then I think we have to turn to the issue of on the revenue side. However, those studies also indicate, roughly speaking, 60% of Alberta's tax advantage with these other provinces is because we don't have a sales tax. And I saw a recent opinion poll that still says that 60% of Albertans don't want to have a sales tax. So we're not there yet. We're not at the point where most Albertans, or a substantial number, would be comfortable with dealing with the deficit issue and the long-term sustainability issue by raising a sales tax. But if and when that day comes, I think the appropriate thing will be to have an HST like some of the other provinces.
So let me put it to you, Trevor, because if it is the case that 60% of the way there could be achieved by a sales tax, but at the moment it's politically unpalatable, are there other options that would get us closer to filling that gap? You mentioned the gas tax. I'm interested in knowing how substantial that is of us being lower relative to other provinces, and if there's anything else that stands out for you.
Well, I think the value of a long-term perspective means that gradual, systematic, but modest changes over time can achieve the same outcome as a larger, more abrupt change in the short term. And so I highlighted the challenge of revenue growth not keeping pace with overall GDP growth. That is something that could be addressed through gradual changes in fees, tax rates, or structures from one year to the next. And we've seen gradual changes on the revenue side in Alberta, even in recent budgets, changing the value of tax credits, whether we should have the tax brackets indexed or not. That was a recent change that increases revenues. Thinking about, as you noted, changes on the gas tax, or maybe changes in income taxes, but branded as a healthcare contribution levy that we see in other provinces, or that Prentice proposed in 2015. So there are lots of options, and thankfully there will be subsequent papers in this series through the School of Public Policy that explores the pros and cons of those different options. In the short term, one that stands out as kind of interesting for me is carbon taxes. This is something where Alberta has an opportunity to potentially take back and redesign and reuse some of the way in which carbon tax revenues are recycled. Right now, federally, it's all or 90% sent back as a household rebate. Alberta could take some of that back and even lower income taxes, say, but then over time use an increasingly growing share of carbon tax revenues to address fiscal challenges. So there's a lot of options, and Alberta is really lucky to be in that position.
Okay, you also mentioned savings. And so I want to talk about that, because there's a couple of ways that we can look at the debt to GDP ratio. If we're using net debt, you can increase your savings, then also put you in a better position. And I come from the Ralph Klein school of thought that aiming to be debt free is something to strive for. And now I'm wondering if we're just dreaming in Technicolor. So let me start with Trevor and ask you about, should we develop a savings plan? And if we did, what would that look like?
I am a strong supporter of saving resource revenues for not just because they are volatile, and using, say, a savings fund to cushion some of that volatility is important, but I view resource revenues not as income in the usual sense, but it is revenues from selling an asset that we own. So savings is one way of converting a physical asset that has value now and will for some time, but not in perpetuity potentially, into a financial asset that can provide returns to the province over the very, very long term. And so that's I think a really important thing to remember. And it is, selling an asset is really a mirror image of borrowing, but it is at higher cost. When you're not saving and earning investment returns in a fund, you are incurring an opportunity cost. You're foregoing those returns. And at least right now, and for some time to come, potentially, those investment returns exceed the cost of government borrowing. And so not saving is expensive in a way that we don't budget in the same way, so it's harder to see. But yeah, I absolutely think we should be saving more resource revenues. And how to do that? Well, again, gradually over time, just gradually increasing, say, the share of resource revenues that are used for budget purposes. Or here we are at a low point, and the best time to get off a roller coaster is, of course, when it is at the bottom. You could kind of lock in a certain amount for budget purposes of, I'm not sure what the number is, 3-4 billion in royalty revenues. And then as growth occurs from there, use that into a fund. And then that would be the portion that cushions the volatility. So again, lots of options. I'd say that absolutely needs to be a part of the conversation for addressing Alberta's long-term fiscal challenges. And I guess,
if I could jump in there,
Yeah.
I mean, of course, we could start to save some of the resource revenues, but then if we just had larger deficit and had to have more debt, we would not be changing our net fiscal debt. So, we have to get the balance first before we really get serious about thinking about saving resource revenue. So just setting up a notional savings rate and then borrowing more to keep our balance. I mean, that would be not a good, wise way to go.
Let me throw it back to Trevor on that one then, because if you're projecting that we're not ever going to close that gap, if you look out your 75 years, is Bev onto something there, that if we are hiving off resource revenues and just digging a deeper hole, does that ever solve the problem, or is there another way to look at that?
So I guess I view them as two distinct but related decisions that we need to approach. How do we close the fiscal gap that we have now and over time? And that can involve changes on the spending and the revenue side. And then what do we do with resource revenues? You can view as about the mix of revenues. And yes, saving resource revenues does mean you're going to need to make up for that somewhere else, either with lower program spending than would otherwise be the case, or higher revenues. So I go through one scenario that I think is an interesting one to consider in a recent piece I wrote actually for the CBC that I didn't include in this chapter, but it's using carbon tax revenues. With that carbon tax rate rising over time, some of those funds can be used in place of resource revenues. And so having other revenue sources can allow you to save resource revenues.
Bev, let me just sort of philosophically then say, let's assume that we do manage to get back into balanced budget. I guess the concern that I would have is that Alberta, part of the reason we keep getting into this problem is as the volatility. And it does strike me that if we just keep on spending every $1 that comes in, we're never going to wean ourselves off that. So you just give me some sort of a sense of, when you were looking at different fiscal anchors, we've seen them before. I think Peter Lougheed had a requirement that 30% of resource revenues had to be saved before that eliminated. I think Stockwell Day's initial plan was that we'd never spend more than $3.5 billion and the rest would go into savings. I think Norway deposits it all and then only draws out what they need for in-year spending. So there have been examples we can look at for how to approach a sort of a fiscal anchor on resource revenues. I just wouldn't mind knowing your thoughts on that, assuming we could get to balanced budget.
Yeah, so I would say if we get to balance, then we have to seriously think about including in the fiscal anchor saving or treatment of resource revenues, and there are other models out there, some of it more successful than others. Maybe I put a plug for a School of Public Policy research paper by Rick Vanderplug. I think it was in 2013, that lays out a very elegant plan for how to save resource revenues. Basically treating like we have above ground wealth and we have below ground wealth, right? The below ground wealth is the value of the resources that are in the ground, and above ground is the financial assets that we have acquired. And the way to think about it then is to maintain or grow that total wealth over time. And that provides a very good way of thinking about the savings rate for resource revenue. So yes, by all means, we need to think about that. And there's lots of good ideas out there for how to do it. Again, the question is not just the political will, but also the public will. Because my view, the problem with the Heritage Fund is that there wasn't a huge buy-in by the public, Albertan public generally, for saving 30% of the resource revenues.
Okay, thank you for that. Stephen's going to think I've been avoiding his question. I haven't really, but it's more of a political question. So I don't know if Trevor and Bev are going to dodge it, but I'm going to ask you it anyway because it's got 10 votes on it. So people are really interested in the answer. So let me go to Trevor first. Stephen says, I work at a large tech company in Seattle. It's one of two big companies investing big in Vancouver, BC. Investments appear to follow political alignment, values alignment, and stability. How is Alberta going to convince potential investors, for example, my corporate leadership, that separatists, climate denial, and COVID denial do not hold undue influence in Alberta's political future? Do we have a political risk? Is there sort of an economics way to answer Stephen's question?
There is an economics way to answer Stephen's question. I'll stick to that rather than stray into the political side of things. Certainly, investors need to think about the risks that they face when making long-term decisions. And those risks take many forms. There will be risks that they face in financial markets. There'll be risks that they face in terms of their customer base and changes in preferences or changes in technology or changes in the number of competitors. And yes, regulatory risk as well. And that's going to be something where in some sectors, the potential for regulatory changes that materially affect your investment or your project are higher than in other sectors. So it very much does depend on what investments we are talking about. We have seen fairly sizable changes in the nature and stringency of regulations in oil and gas, say, or in the electricity generation sector. And those are something that indeed investors will need to think about. And that's not unique to Alberta. Every jurisdiction is going to have its own set of risks that will need to be considered by investors making long-term decisions. So I don't think, or I'm not sure I've seen any evidence suggesting that Alberta is more risky or has some fundamentally different type of politics. I mean, sometimes politics is messy, and indeed there are times when it's, I guess, more intense than other times. But yeah, that's not unique to Alberta.
Deb, let me throw it to you. I mean, it's funny. I think Alberta has been accustomed to looking at our political culture as being a net advantage. Are we on the cusp of having it being a net disadvantage?
Well, I mean, we had a single party, quote unquote, in government for a very long period of time, which suggested stability. But of course, within that party, there were major changes in leadership and direction. And then we did have a change with the election, of course, of the NDP in 2015. But again, I think you look at other provinces or other jurisdictions, there is more stability in terms of, I think, outlook. Sometimes that stability is not necessarily good because they're not dealing with the problem, but we don't see, in my estimation, huge swings in direction like you sometimes see in other countries. I'm thinking of, for example, Brazil. I'm thinking of Mexico. I mean, where it's just black and white, one government to the next, and they just cancel whatever policies the other government had in place. So, I think politically, this province is not an outlier in terms of instability by any means.
Okay, thanks for that, Bev. Todd Hirsch has a question, and it's interesting because I've kind of taken it for granted because I've seen a lot of studies done this way where we compare our per capita spending with the three largest provinces, so BC, Ontario, and Quebec. But Todd asked, what is the rationale for comparing Alberta's per capita spending to only the three largest provinces? Is it the correct comparison? Let me put that to Bev first.
Yeah, so that's the comparison we adopted in the Blue Ribbon panel report. And one of the things that does affect provincial spending is the size of the jurisdiction, because there are economies of scale in especially I think capital spending. So to include Prince Edward Island in as a comparative province is stretching things a bit. Are those three provinces the only provinces you should probably look at? Maybe not. I think Saskatchewan, including looking at what's happening in Saskatchewan from a fiscal perspective, is also appropriate given agriculture, other the resources. But yeah, I think broadly speaking, it's not necessarily the national average. So I was comfortable with the three that we chose, but would be open to seeing Saskatchewan added, for example.
Okay, perfect. Trevor, you can weigh in on that if you want as well, but let me pose another question for you. First of all, Brian says, Bev, it's great to see you. So Brian Livingston sounds like he's a long-term friend, Bev, but he's asking the question, as a lawyer, I learned very early that a right without a remedy is useless. What remedies does anyone have to enforce against a government that does not comply with the fiscal anchor? Is the remedy just a political one, namely throwing the government out at the next election? Or are there legal remedies that provide or that a private citizen can apply for? Let me let Trevor start that, and I'll go back over to you after, Bev.
Sure. Well, of course, as a democracy, you'll have governments rightly making policies that can achieve broad support by the public. And I know that's a broad oversimplification of the political process, but I'm a strong believer that governments will have the scope and the space to make responsible decisions, very clearly outlining what the pros and cons are. If there's information out there and if the public can fully appreciate and understand what the pros and cons of those decisions are. So part of the benefit of incorporating regular reporting and information and communication about long-term challenges is to give government the space to take decisions with that longer term view. So I don't think it's about enforcing, I think it's about informing.
Okay, perfect. Bev, how would you respond to that? Is there any way
Well,
to bind governments?
So, enforceability is kind of a spectrum. Another one of my good friends, Ted Morton, has a paper in which he suggests the fiscal rule could be incorporated in Alberta's constitution, the constitution for Alberta, based on a referendum, and therefore making it very difficult for a government not to abide by it. But of course, that would have a cost in terms of, let's say, flexibility, because it would be very hard to write a general flexible rule in a constitution. So I tend to agree with Trevor. I think it's more important that it's part of the political language and discussion, and that people understand it, and so to Tim Hortons, it's something that people would be aware of, and therefore will affect actual behavior of governments.
All right. I want to sort of formally end our session today, but I don't want to leave before I've gotten the most popular questions asked. So I've got a couple more questions to go. If you need to go, as I mentioned before, all of the webinars are posted on the School of Public Policy website. So let me just get through these last two that each have 3 votes on them. And if you missed the discussion, you can go there and hear the final questions. Peter has asked the question, is there any reason to expect anchors from the UCP government to be maintained by the Notley NDP, which appears likely to form a majority government in 2023? Let me put that to you, Bev. Can you create rules? What do you typically see? It does strike me that they are very open to a change in government. Have we seen evidence that you can see fiscal anchors survive even with a change in government?
Well, I can't tell you, definitively based on evidence, but first of all, I think that even the fiscal anchors that this government has adopted will have to be changed or modified in 2023. So we're going to be looking at an evolving fiscal anchor anyway. I think if the Notley government, future Notley government thinks about that, it probably would adopt some sort of notion around a debt ratio, because that's common to these kind of anchors. And they probably would also have some description around balanced budget or long-term fiscal sustainability. So yeah, so again, I'm seeing this more as an evolving thing that, of course, any future government will be involved in modifying them.
Okay, let me go to Trevor, because I think, and I'll come back to you on this one too, Bev. It feels like Alberta's and Canada's debt load and deficit spending is at the limit. This comes from Peter. What would tip it over for Alberta and Canada on interest rates, inflation, trade balance, other factors? What worries you the most? What does the tipping over mean to Canadians? I mean, I'll tell you what worries me most, Trevor, is the danger of interest rate increases. It's not unfathomable to me that we could be in a world of 6% interest rates, which is double what we have now, which means a doubling of the interest payment. So that's kind of what keeps me up at night. What worries you?
Sure. So your comment there about interest rates changing, that was very much the type of fiscal risk that I was talking about or that I talk about in the chapter, and that I briefly mentioned in the talk, that the larger the stock of debt that you have, the more exposed you are to adverse developments, not just in terms of interest rate increases, but also future recessions. So economic growth and interest rates are 2 very important parts of debt sustainability. So I don't view there being some fiscal cliff where everything is fine and then all of a sudden there is a problem. There's a continuum, and we're not at a tipping point, which is not to say that we're not increasing at the margin the degree of fiscal risk that we face. And so I look to the debt to GDP ratio and the trajectories over time, and I don't see, and the analysis that I've published through the school and elsewhere finds that most provinces don't have a debt to GDP ratio that is sustainable. An aging population is not something that keeps me up at night, but is clearly the bigger challenge that governments need to think about, because it is large. It's slow moving, but it is large. To give us a sense of federally, what do interest rate increases mean for the federal debt to GDP trajectory? So my own estimates there do suggest that despite the large borrowing that we've seen recently, if we can stick to the plan in the out years that was reported in the budget around revenue increases and spending, modest spending growth rates, then the federal debt's sustainable, but it will take about 20 years for the federal debt to GDP ratio to get back to pre-COVID levels. And in that span of time, we're almost surely going to have a recession hitting and interest rates rising. And so bringing that debt level down with, in a more accelerated way by thinking about lower federal spending growth, increasing the old age security eligibility again, for example, or thinking about changes in the GST rate, or lots of options, but bringing that debt level down in a slightly quicker pace would, I guess, mitigate that fiscal risk that we face.
All right, Beth, we heard Trevor talk about interest rate risk as well as the aging population risk. Anything else that has you concerned?
Well, again, just maybe to reiterate, again, the analysis of Trevor, the PBO and others is the provinces, broadly speaking, have a problem of rising debt, and the federal government doesn't really face that kind of issue. Whether there's a fiscal cliff or a debt cliff, I think the analysis that I've seen through the IMF is it could be, we're quite a ways away from it right now. Doesn't mean we want to get close to it though. Yes, because, so I think we need to think that this issue around debt sustainability is more of a provincial issue, and especially an issue here in Alberta, as Trevor's analysis has amply indicated.
All right, the professor's weighing in saying it's time to wrap it up. I gather that they don't go overtime very often in university seminars. It was always the problem that my boss had with me at work, is trying to blow through any of our breaks. I want you to make sure that you do know that we've got more of these to come. We'd like to thank you for joining us today as well. Keep an eye on your email inbox. Not only will you get a link to this webinar, but you also get a link to register for future upcoming webinars. You can go to www.policyschool.ca, and it is webinars. We've had just a delightful conversation, although a bit of an anxiety producing one with Dr. Trevor Toome and with Dr. Bev Dalby. I'm Danielle Smith. With that, I think Professor Mackenzie wants to weigh in again. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you all very much. I have to get the last word in, Danielle. You know that. It was so interesting today. I think this was an absolute fabulous launch to our pre-publications. So many questions arising. I can tell you that some of them will be addressed in forthcoming papers, including my own and including Danielle's. So I think we're going to be able to have maybe slightly different perspectives on some of the answers. I loved seeing the economists squirm under the political questions. That was great. So thank you all for that. So I'll just simply say thank you for attending. We'll be releasing more papers in the coming weeks, and we'll be making some announcements on our next webinars coming up. So stay tuned, and thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.